For our next panel, we're going to bring out some leaders in performance management. We're going to bring out some representatives from the City of Atlanta, City of Louisville, and also the state of Iowa. And helping to lead this discussion will be Stephen Goldsmith, who is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and also the author of the book, The Responsive City. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
I think we'll do city and then state, so we'll start with you, then we'll begin. Do you introduce me? Okay, good. All right, we're going to have a conversation for exactly 40 minutes, 39 minutes and 58 seconds. And because the time is relatively short and the subject is interesting, we've forbidden the guests from having opening statements. So this, now, it'll take a lot of kind of aggressive interrupting to keep them from inserting their opening statements otherwise, but we've kind of done that. And so we're going to talk about the kind of emerging areas of using open data and performance. We have three of the country's best operators in that area. Their information is in your booklet, but from to my left, your right, first is Matt, who runs a program in Atlanta. Each one of these titles is sufficiently confusing, I have to read it. Office of Innovation and Performance. There you go. More or less. Matt has an interesting perspective because he has a number of pieces under him in the mayor's office. Doro is in Louisville. Louisville has obviously a national reputation for innovation and performance. He's director of quality and performance, which I thought was an interesting title because could you be a director of performance and not quality, or do you have to? Why do you have to put director of quality and performance?
Living my dream.
All right, okay. Some of us think that inherent in performance is quality, but that's good to know anyway. And then Scott is a senior performance analyst in the Iowa Department of Management, and his perspective is interesting as well. So we're just going to begin with a set of conversations, and I think maybe, Matt, just to begin with you. So, you know, we have people in the audience and in the conference, right, the pieces to this puzzle are in various places, right? There's a performance office, there's a CIO office, there's a CDO who sometimes works for the CIO and sometimes works for somebody else. About half the cities now have chief innovation officers, and they may be in a different place. And then there's the budget guru who tells everybody else that they can't do what they really wanted to do anyway, right? Mm-hmm. And you're all of those things. So tell us a little bit how you're using open data and leveraging it across the kind of multiple threads that are kind of uniquely woven into your office.
Yeah, not all, but we actually, do it. We do all 20 things better than everyone else could ever possibly hope to do them. No, it's a very good question. We are a bit unique in the sense that in what many other cities might have as separate job functions, as you mentioned, we have all in one place in the mayor's office. And that can be a good thing because we have a lot of resources and different areas of expertise that we can bring to bear, but sometimes the phrase, it's like herding cats, comes to mind. You've got budget, innovation, performance, projects, all very unique skill sets and different points of view. And the one thing I've found that makes us the most effective is to really focus on a very specific goal in whatever you are trying to employ the teams. It's sort of counterintuitive that the broader your scope, the narrower your goal has to be, and the more sort of data-driven and focused your goal needs to be to move the team forward. I don't know how deep you want to go, Steve, on my opening answer. I do have a quick example I can provide before we get in.
Yeah, let's do an example.
So one area that's been a big priority for our mayor has been public safety. And that's a very broad area, obviously, police, fire, et cetera. All of those departments fit into public safety. But one area we have not looked at is how we leverage our other sort of non-core public safety employees to improve our public safety, and we were tasked with figuring this out. And I'll spare you a lot of the back and forth, but eventually where we ended up on was a very focused goal of reducing the amount of vehicle accidents that our employees who drive vehicles cause on a daily basis, and specifically reducing the number of unsafe behaviors that any employee driving a car or a vehicle has. What that helped us do, picking that very specific goal, was focus all of these different resources that we have. So from an innovation perspective, we were able to look at what are the different ways we can reduce accidents, what are the pieces of technology and software and processes and policies that we can employ, and pick one to move forward with. From a budget perspective, we were able to make the case to do that and to get it funded. We had a project management team who was able to implement that technology and those new processes, and then we were able to layer all of that into the performance management practices that we have. And in about 6 months, we have driven, I think it's about a 65% decrease in the number of unsafe behaviors that we are seeing in any given vehicle, and that's all tracked through cameras in vehicles. So the reason we're able to do this is because we picked a very specific target to get to, decreasing the number of unsafe behaviors and decreasing vehicle accidents, whereas had we just said, let's figure out ways to get our employees to engage in more safe behaviors, you're going to have 20 different proposals and you're going to spin your wheels trying to figure out what's the way to go.
So I want to move to Doro, but before I do, just since this is a Socrata event, let's focus on performance data. Let's focus on the difference sometimes between performance data and open data, right? It's not always the same thing.
No.
So just really quickly in that last example, how much of that data could the public see? And how much could the agency see?
The answer initially to the public was not much. We were very focused internally first, and that's sort of the tack we have taken in Atlanta, which is use performance data as a wedge to open people's minds to the idea of open data. So by making the data available to our departments, getting those people on board that we can drive a change, we then delivered more of an appetite for what folks in the audience would call open data, where we can begin releasing this out to the public, and it helps that we use performance management to get our shop a little bit more in order before we did that.
Good. So Doro, you're a lean guru of multiple colored belts, I think. And so some people, lean means inexpensive, save money, you know. And but you're into, you know, by definition and your reputation, you're into quality. So how are you using open data to drive quality metrics, right? And how does that relate to your kind of Six Sigma efforts?
That's a great question. So when we ever have an opportunity to improve, we need to define exactly what that is, right? And so what that means is that we want to move from, oh, we've gone from inspecting restaurants 2 times, which we should do per year according to state statute, to we're not only doing inspections, but we're actually finding opportunities to improve what is inspected within those restaurants. So it's not just the counts of things, it's, well, what do you discover once you're actually in the restaurant, and you know, what are your customers telling you? What I think about is making data accessible, and I think open data does that, right? Like, if people are going to use the data, it must be accessible. But from a quality perspective, we need to look at, you know, from a systems perspective, how do our processes work together, and what are the feedback loops between service delivery, those who provide the services, and then those who use the services, so we can design the concerns of our customers into how we fundamentally build the, you know, process to deliver those services. And I think that if we don't have data, then it's hard to have a baseline and then do something which is tied to your cause and effect theory. So I think open data can lean itself very nicely with any structured problem-solving exercise.
And how do you, let's go to your restaurants for a second. So what if the public, think San Francisco and Yelp, or Chicago and their food safety inspections, what if the public knows something you don't? right? And this is a friendly question, not a hostile question, right? So you know, their data shows that there's a set of restaurants that are more likely to end in diners having unpleasant results, right? How does that open data, which is different than government open data, how do those come together on your quality and performance index?
Right. Now, the way it actually happens may be different from the way that it should happen, but what we always find is that when our inspectors go out, there are reports which are generated. Now, open data requires that you define what you want to make open, and you typically don't make the comment box open, right? Because the comment box is very unstructured, it's non-uniform data. But if you figure out the identity of a segment of restaurants which typically get more complaints, then you do more structured kind of investigation using a representative sample of a cross-section of restaurants in a certain jurisdiction, and then you can figure, okay, if we are getting more complaints here, what are the nature of those complaints, why are they happening, and how can we collaborate with the right stakeholders, including those who own and operate the restaurants, to address why there are frequent complaints.
After we go up to the state government level, I want to come back and chat with you a little bit more about your quality index, because I feel like, and I've been in local government for like 30 years one way or another, I feel like we measure a lot of activities,
right,
not necessarily a lot of quality performance, right? Because we assume that they're the same thing. More of this produces more of that, not necessarily. So, but while we're on the kind of this community engagement piece, right, I know one of the things that, Scott, you're particularly proud of is that you've used your public data has become, you pay attention to becoming actionable and community engagement and how it's used. So what are the steps you've taken to go from just open data to usable data where the community can engage around that data?
Well, we've been really working towards in the last year or so to really look at the types of data sets that we're publishing, and one of the pieces that I always start with is that we have a lot of data as a state in a variety of different subjects, but to focus on those that we think will help tell our story, to help address the issues that we're dealing with as an agency or agencies, because a lot of them are cross over multiple agencies, and look at those types of factors to prioritize what we're going to publish next. And to really kind of, even within our own agencies, is to think about what do we have that other agencies can benefit from, because I'm finding as we go down this path how much one agency really utilizes data sets from another agency to help define what it is that they're doing and how well they're doing it. So when I work...
I don't want you to stop your story, but how do you, does that just happen organically, or do you stir that pot somehow?
I try to stir the pot a little bit. I look at our agency. We actually are responsible for our Accountable Government Act. So for the last nearly 15 years, we've actually been collecting performance measure type information from agencies. So one of my initial focuses when I'm talking to agencies, I'll look through that first. I'll look through what they've been submitting as part of the budget to help initiate the discussions. So that really helps give me a little more context on what they think is important, and helps me kind of focusing in on areas that I think they need to start looking at. Based on that, I can also tell what other agencies are using from those same reports if they're relying on information from a certain agency.
So in a minute, we'll go to audience questions. If you have to ask, the farther you are from the speakers, the more it's required you ask a question. So just try to come up with a question. So let's just, for a second, make this kind of go back to Matt, to all three of you, and make this a little more difficult. So there's a lot of things that when you run a stat program and you measure performance and you're devoted to performance and quality, there's a lot of stuff the agencies really don't want to make public. So how do the three of you decide when you're running a rigorous performance stat program, how much of that matures itself to the open data side and how much of it stays inside, at least in the early stages? We'll go down this way again, Matt.
Well, what I found is that, Atlanta, we started with essentially no open data and a culture that was not all that interested in open data. And what I found is you definitely can't go from 0 to 100 because there's that fear out there that you're going to put something out and reporters going to come calling and you're going to land yourself on the front page of the paper. And so what I have found, which is sort of what I mentioned before, is that you start off by using your data internally from a performance management perspective. You get folks on board with the idea of using data to measure and to manage, and then you can begin taking sections of that. And at the beginning, you can take sections that have been vetted and approved and maybe aren't your worst performing area and put them out. And sort of it's, this is the worst analogy, but I can't think of another one. You put the frog in the cold water and then slowly turn the heat up. You know what I mean? It's sort of like that. Again, that's a terrible analogy. But
Have you ever run for office?
no, and
Just asking.
after this clip, I don't think I will be able to.
No, I understand, but yeah.
Yeah, and you get people used to it over time, and that's the approach that we have employed, and people eventually realize that, people aren't going to beat down your door every single time you release a data set. And in fact, 90% of what you get is positive.
Doro, Louisville's created a kind of culture of performance. How do you deal with the fact that even if you're in a city as performance-oriented as you are, there's some things, even if you were just working through them as problems where they look a little embarrassing in the beginning. How do you decide what to put up publicly?
That's a great question. So I'm going to go into the realm of what it takes to care for animals, our kennels, our adoptions, and it's an area which is near and dear to my heart. But we have many stakeholders who really care about the euthanasia rate, right? And what does euthanasia mean? It means that for time and space, unfortunately, we're not getting positive animal outcomes or animals are dying, right? So what we did was we embraced this weakness orientation, which is very difficult to do. Pay attention to what's not going well and then do problem solving around the euthanasia rate. And we worked with a lot of stakeholders across the community to help us really figure out how do we spray, neuter, release, how do we increase adoptions, how do we basically do what's right for what we can. But what that meant was that for open data, we're going to publish those animals that have to be euthanized for lack of time and space. They're healthy, they're adoptable, but we have finite space within our, I would say, deteriorating and aging, kennels. And by being open about here is the community's problem, we were able to get the right stakeholders on board, and I believe we've gone from around 45% live release rate, up is good, to about 75%, sometimes 81% live release rate.
That's good. Of course, one way to do that with open data is tell the front end of your organization to slow down picking up stray dogs. Right, I always say that, not to suggest that that's the right thing to do, but that for every performance measure, there's kind of something that has to be
there's a good and a bad.
Continuously. So speaking of iteration, which is the point of my story, not to suggest inefficiency as a solution to quality, but how do you deal with the trade-offs, Scott? How do you think about the trade-offs? There's always trade-offs in the data. There's always trade-offs in how you measure. And how do you iterate those and create a process where it's always getting better?
Well, in some of that, what I really want them to do is really take a look at what kind of questions that they're asking to begin with, and are those the right things to be measuring? Because I think a lot of times in performance management, sometimes the measures that were selected were the easiest ones to measure, and that isn't necessarily the best approach to take. And oftentimes it's getting them to look beyond that, to look at what truly are the questions we need to answer and what do we need to address and what kind of data supports that. So it's kind of starting to get moving people in that direction. Now, there are some agencies that have done a very good job of that. There are that they may have the right questions, but the time frames in which they measure may not be frequent enough to really have a clear picture of what's going on in cases like that. It's looking at how can we measure on a more frequent basis, or how can we make that data set more granular so we have a better understanding of what's going on, or we can drill into it to have a better understanding of what's happening. Because I see a lot of measures that are done on an annual basis, and it takes years before you can really have a clear picture of what's happening in a situation or with an issue. So it's getting to move beyond that, look at their frequency and the granularity of the data that they're utilizing them for measurement purposes.
Good. Do you have any questions in the audience? There's mics somewhere. Anybody?
In your three different organizations, who is making the determination of what performance metrics are measured and then ultimately what's released?
That's
Go ahead, Darrell. Somebody other than Matt can start this one.
Yeah,
sure.
save the best for last this time.
Matt's very competitive. Well, I work for one of the best-run city-county merged governments in the nation. Just to let you know.
Along with Atlanta, probably.
Well, we're not city
Maybe
county.
Iowa as
We're
well.
not city county, so it's okay to say that.
I'm state, so I'm out of this competition.
But that's a great question. Who decides what is the question, correct? Because we like to look at everyone else's dirty laundry, if there's an issue, a problem, or opportunity for improvement which touches multiple departments across the public safety space, or just it's payroll-based or personnel-based, we more or less decide. But we honestly delegate and give the authority for the line managers to define what they want to measure, if we have the right methodology in place to discover what the measure should be. And there's a good and a bad to that, but it does create more buy-in, because what can I do to tell the chief of police what to measure, right? There's a lot of pushback there unless we collaborate. Then if we have what's accessible and what's of interest, then we put that on the open data portal. But it does take effort and energy to make data open. And there's a trade-off to working on open data and doing routine operational work, or working on open performance.
Matt?
So in Atlanta, in a vacuum, that answer would be the mayor. The mayor can make a call on any of this. But on a day-to-day basis, the mayor does not get too involved with this. And so the decision often falls to the head of any given department, because where we are, they have access to the data, and we could, in theory, create a big stink if they're not getting us what we want and we don't think they're measuring the right things, but that's not good business. And so what we have found is the most effective way is to, Darrell mentioned collaboration. I'd call it creating good working relationships with these departments, and by doing that, you begin to gain their trust and get more say and make it easier for them to get on board with publishing the data that you suggest they publish. But they're not going to do that if you have not worked with them to build a culture of trust first, so that they don't think you're going to just take their crappy data and put it out there to air their dirty laundry.
Your question is an interesting one in the following way. So you have a set of elected official visions for his or her community, right? How do you measure well-being? How do you measure healthy community? Some set of maybe goals or vision, depending on how you define it. And then inside of those, somebody has to decide which of the metrics in various agencies will produce that result, right? And one of the confusing things, not only about government, but about the conversation, right, is that we tend to measure both publicly and internally by a set of activities that occur inside a vertical agency, even though we run kind of collaborative horizontal cities or states, right? They're neighborhoods, they're not the transportation department. And so the process, and you can think about this in the following way, right? So what if it's homelessness, and you're measuring homelessness by the number of people who are homeless, and you're holding the homeless agency responsible for that. But it's really, you know what the problem is? The problem is that there's not enough domestic violence support, there's not enough drug abuse support, there's not enough fill-in-the-blank support, right? Or Section 8 support for whatever. And so trying to get those things continuously measured requires somebody at the executive level level to kind of referee and bundle them up, right? So it's fun in one way because it's really quite challenging to get it right, but it's really quite breathtaking as well because you can, little levers over here can create big performance over here. So, you know, years ago, Iowa used to have a charter agency. Would you work in state government when they had the?
Oh, yeah.
Why don't you explain a little bit, because that's one way to think about using performance data to rank accountability to give more flexibility in the
I haven't thought about charter agencies in years, though.
What's that?
Yeah, the concept behind the charter agency was to allow flexibilities in which and how agencies operated, and give them a little bit of flexibility on what was the standard rules and procedures that agencies were to follow if they could demonstrate that that would actually improve efficiency. You know, unfortunately, it was a kind of a short-lived program under one administration, so it was hard to really see what kind of effect or long-term impact that would have. But the idea was is to provide a mechanism for agencies to look at things and do things differently. But I second you in terms of identifying measures at the state level. It's very challenging because as a state government, you know, there's so many different programs that you're responsible for, everywhere from human services, Medicaid, to education, to, you know, parks and recreation, environmental protection programs, elder affairs types issues. It's just across the board. So how do you organize that in such a way? In Iowa, we actually have enterprise strategic plans, so we do focus on 4 main areas and then try to identify metrics that fit within those. But then each agency has responsibility because of our Accountable Government Act, to do their own strategic planning, to do performance planning on an annual basis and measure results related to that. With our open data, we're trying to take that a step further. Now that you've been doing that, can we actually get to the data and make that more accessible to the public and other agencies that might have use of it, so people can draw their own conclusions with the information? Because oftentimes it's a highly summarized version of the data that we're putting out to the public. So can we get it out there in a more detailed way so they can not only see, you know, what kind of impact we've been making towards this certain issue, but are there differences in a variety of different categories that are related to that issue, so we can get to that point.
Other questions? Yes.
I have a question about you kind of being the bad guys and come in and make.
Well, just tell us where you're from, just so we can.
From Montgomery County, which is Iowa. So when you talk about trying not to be the bad guys, how do you go from gathering performance measures and data and putting stuff out on performance from a bureaucratic exercise or at worst a form of punishment, especially getting management and leadership using the data for their own decision-making, not just perform punishment?
That's a fantastic question, and it's a very difficult one to answer, but I'll take a stab at it, Matt. So what we have in Louisville is an interesting requirement that the data, the process is owned by the departments, and we create a way to co-discover the measures with the department. So we create tools. We use the enterprise model, which basically looks at your fundamental purpose and how you achieve that purpose through your critical business processes, which deliver your required services. But we get the management to define that in a structured way. And then they identify what indicators are tied to gaps in performance. And then, of course, we prioritize that, but actually they do the prioritization. And that has created so much more buy-in than coming in and saying, hey, police chief, why don't you measure your response time? Well, there are a lot of factors that go into response time. What if the police chief and the line staff are more interested in measuring and improving the performance of something different?
Yeah, it's. I think we can all agree that however you approach it, you probably, unless you just have an extremely heavy mandate, you can't just come into a department like a bull in a china shop and say, you know, here's your metrics and give me your data. It's just not going to work. And I mentioned creating a culture of trust, which is a big, lofty ideal. Frankly, the simplest thing I've found to do is go up to the head of a department and say, what can we help you with? You know, forget performance management, forget open data, put that aside. I've got a team that's great with numbers, great with process improvement. Do you have a problem that we can help you out with? And we did that for our fire chief. We helped them analyze what's called out-of-territory response, which I won't get into, but basically when a fire engine has to cover another territory that they're not assigned to, and helped them figure out why this was happening in certain areas and what was the issue and how they could address it. And something like that, which is fairly, it's not super simple, but it's also not PhD level statistics, went a long way to building that culture of trust, and they were much more open to working with us after that. And there's, I think, working in government, every department has a problem, right? And there's a lot of very sophisticated people in this room who have skills that your departments or agencies don't have, and you can employ those for good to help build that culture of trust. We found that to be very effective.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I think you know, to force their hand to provide data or measure it, you may get it once, but one of the challenges that we have, I'm sure you guys face, is to make sure that's continually up to date and current, because I find the more current it is, the more relevant it is, and the more valuable it is to people. So really it's to, like you said, it's to find out what kinds of things do they need help with. I always look at it, can we create things that agencies will find to be useful tools? Because if they see it as a useful tool, it's easy to get the information that we want. So if we can create that, going into an agency and talking to them about getting data and presenting it in different ways becomes much easier.
So just to try to be a bit poetic here for a second. So the people who, we had this conversation a little earlier ago, that the people who create noise are going to create noise. The people who want a freedom of information FOIA you are going to FOIA you. The people who want to throw stones are going to find the stones to throw at you, right? So the question is then, so what about open data? Well, if you think about trust in government, providing the political capital, and I don't mean Republican, Democrat, but the political capital for the county executive to do great aspirational things for his or her county, right? That political capital is generated by trust, and trust is generated by open government and open data, and just those little acts of, you know, it's not so much that my pothole is not going to get filled for 4 days or 3 days or 2 days. It's matching reality with expectations that creates trust, the follow through in government. And so I think one way to handle the issue, in addition to the kind of the very specific steps of the three panelists, is just to say, why open data? Why is it important to civic society? Why is it important to democracy? And what will that do when we have something really big and aspirational we need to do as a community? How can we use that trust we developed on the political capital side? I think it's a pretty kind of relatively foundational issue. We have 8 minutes and 43 seconds, if anybody has a couple more questions. This is a really very vivid clock in front of me. Others? It's just because we're going to go between Prince George's and Montgomery County back and forth across the...
What came first, your performance initiatives or the discussion of open data and openness?
Good question. In Louisville, open performance came first, then open data, and right now we are in the process of merging the two. And I do think that it's very different when you have accountability and ownership by agencies and departments and want to use open data to tell the story. Then create your target expectations and talk about performance expectations.
Let's reverse the order a little bit here. Scott, and then we'll go to Matt.
In Iowa, the performance came first. We've been doing performance measures, performance planning since 2001. So it was a little bit obviously way ahead of the open data portals and things you see today. However, because of the open data now, it's really making us rethink about how we're approaching our performance and how we've done that, you know, over the last few years. It's technology's there. I mean, we used to rely on reports on some set frequency. Now you can think of, is there a way we can make that information more interactive, more up to date? available, more current than what we currently are showing in our just reports themselves. So,
Matt?
Yeah, we were performance first. My hypothesis would be that most cities are going to be performance just by the simple fact of you've got CompStat going back to like the 80s.
Right.
And the technology for true open data has probably not been available for, I would say, probably less than a decade. Now, and I would actually say, and we don't have to go too far down this rabbit hole, but for the better part of that time, I think probably performance data and open data were just the same thing. Like taking your performance data and posting it online was people's definition of open data until companies like Socrata made it possible to define those two differently. But I think our data culture is very driven still by performance management, and we're adding open data into that now.
So let's do 2-minute closing statements from Scott this way, but not freelance closing statements.
All right.
Could you address the following? Right. So we've had a good discussion about the various issues with open data and performance data. So let's accept the proposition that the more individuals in the community who take advantage of open data and the more employees in the public sector who use the open data, the better the production of services will be, right? So talk to us a little bit, one at a time, about how you get more employees to actually, now that the data is open, how do they manipulate the data? How do they look at the data? I'm in an agency, what do? I'm a community leader, how do I do it? So let's talk about how to increase the take-up rate and the usability and the operationalizing of that data.
Well, I think it really kind of, talking to those points specifically, I think it's going back to agencies and making sure that the data is organized in such a way that facilitates, creating the necessary visualizations that will help answer those questions that they have. You talked about text being unstructured. I look at data sets all the time that, if it's free-form text rather than establishing categories and things like that, is to making sure that data is structured in such a way that it makes it easy for people to be able to create visualizations on their own and have a better understanding was. So providing the context, making sure it's categorical in nature, and giving people the tools in which to do that. So.
Okay, thanks. Doro?
Just to add to that, we need a compelling open data story. We need role models at the supervisor, manager, director, assistant director, senior leader role, talking about open data, using it. We need training. Employees need to be trained on basic data 101, and we need to listen to them about what questions they have about the data and what they would like to see, because they're the closest to the work which produces the data, right? And then we need a way of reinforcing why the compelling story is important. Why can open data help us do what we do, but do it even better?
Thank you. Matt?
Yeah, I mean, from a technical perspective, obviously you need usability, and Socrata is helping tremendously with that. But what I come back to is once you have that, it's showing people how this data can help them solve a problem that they have. And that's both internal, like I talked about before, but external. If you just release a bunch of data, for the most part, you'll have folks who are interested in it, like Ben Wellington, and will figure out what's important, but most people will look at it and their eyes will glaze over, and that will be that. But if you say, you've got this issue, either you've got this internal operations issue, or you as a citizen have this issue, here's a data set and here's how you can solve it, you begin to whet that appetite and create that pull strategy to broaden your base of open data. So figuring out how it solves specific problems.
Doro, since you and your city have such a reputation, I'll give you 30 seconds more. Tell us about cross-agency use of open data to drive performance.
That's a great question. We have embarked on an interesting journey because we have, like most communities, homicides are going up. Sometimes, suicides are at an alarming rate. It takes a village to get a collective impact to reduce those problems. So we just held a series of summits, one on what we call the One Love Initiative, which seeks to reduce, homicides and suicides and create health and safe neighborhoods. We planned, led by Mary Hampton and our Director of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods and his staff, an effort to get a lot of people across the community together to plan on the data collection tools and plans to answer the questions, and then make the community's data integrated or part of our open data portal. So it's not just the city, county government's data, it's everyone's data which answers this problem. And we're also working with our university and Socrata, the White House, on uniform citations for arrest and putting that online so that people can see, well, here is what's happening. There has been an erosion of trust between communities and police departments, but we do have the raw data which answers some level of what activity is happening, and it's for everyone's consumption and can aid in the discussion.
So now we know that the panelists are inherently very competitive. Let me thank, and you can help me thank, one from the best run city, one from the best run consolidated city and county, and one from the best run state. Please thank our panelists.